Shadows in the mind, why we fear what we don't understand. Have you ever walked into a dark room and felt something, or someone, was watching you? Have you ever heard a whisper when no one else was there, or sensed a presence just beyond your vision? These eerie moments make our hearts race. They make us wonder, are ghosts real? Across cultures and centuries, the idea of spirits, especially those who linger beyond death, has haunted human imagination. From haunted houses and horror films to spiritual seances and ancestral rituals, we are drawn to the mystery of what lies beyond this life. But while most people react with fear, fascination, or skepticism, Buddhism offers a different lens, one that neither mocks nor glorifies, but instead seeks to understand. In Buddhist thought, the question isn't merely do ghosts exist? But why do they exist, if they do? And more importantly, what do they teach us about our own minds, attachments, and fears? Ghosts, or Pitas as they are referred to in Buddhist cosmology, are not ghouls out to scare us, but beings trapped in a cycle of craving, suffering, and longing. Their existence is a mirror, reflecting the consequences of unwholesome actions and unresolved desires. But here's the deeper truth, the real ghost may not be some lost spirit in the night. It may be the fear that haunts our own hearts, fear of death, fear of the unknown, fear of letting go. And that fear isn't conquered by ghost hunting tools or rituals, it's overcome through understanding, compassion, and transformation of the self. This article isn't about proving whether ghosts are real in a Hollywood sense. Instead, we'll journey through ancient sutras, modern psychology, and personal stories to explore what Buddhism truly teaches about the spirit world and why it matters more than you think. Are ghosts real? Maybe. But a better question might be, are we living fully, mindfully, and fearlessly so we don't become the ghosts of our own unlived lives? Let's begin. Beyond shadows, what Buddhism really says about ghosts. When we hear the word ghost, what usually comes to mind are chilling tales, haunted houses, and eerie figures drifting through the dark. Popular culture has trained us to associate ghosts with terror, restless spirits seeking revenge, cursed souls lurking in abandoned buildings. But Buddhism invites us to look at this concept from a completely different angle, not one of fear, but of understanding and compassion. In Buddhist cosmology, beings that resemble what we call ghosts do exist, but not in the horror movie sense. These beings are known as Pitas, or hungry ghosts. Far from being malicious entities out to harm the living, Pitas are described as deeply suffering beings, wandering in a state of emotional and spiritual starvation. Their condition is not caused by evil or punishment, but by karma, the natural law of cause and effect. The Buddha didn't spend time trying to prove or disprove the existence of ghosts. Instead, he focused on something far more transformative, helping us understand why beings like Pitas exist at all, and what we can learn from their stories. His teachings are not meant to entertain our curiosity about the supernatural, but to awaken our moral awareness, our empathy, and our responsibility for the energy we carry in this life, and possibly beyond. In the Buddhist view, a Pita is someone who, due to strong attachments, greed, selfishness, or unresolved emotions, is reborn into a realm characterized by craving without satisfaction. Imagine constantly desiring food, water, love, or peace, and never being able to attain it. This is the condition of a hungry ghost. They are not ghosts in chains, they are beings chained by their own cravings. One famous depiction from Buddhist scripture describes a Pita with a gigantic, bloated stomach and a mouth as small as the eye of a needle, a grotesque and painful metaphor for how greed can distort our existence. It's a poignant image, not meant to horrify, but to illustrate how inner imbalance can manifest in outer realities. This concept may sound distant or mythological, but its meaning is close to home. How many people do we know who live with insatiable hunger, not just for food, but for validation, power, attention, or material possessions? These people might not be ghosts in a literal sense, but their suffering mirrors the Pita condition. They live surrounded by abundance, yet remain deeply unsatisfied. From a Buddhist lens, this is a type of spiritual haunting, being trapped by one's own attachments, even in a human body. Buddhism teaches us that we carry the seeds of every realm within our own minds. The hungry ghost realm is not necessarily out there, it can be in us. When we act from greed, when we cannot let go, when we are never content no matter what we have, we begin to experience life through the lens of a pitta. And that is a form of suffering we often ignore because it wears a human face. But the beauty of Buddhist wisdom is that it does not stop at diagnosis, it offers medicine. These teachings encourage us to live in a way that reduces craving, enhances generosity, and promotes mindfulness. We are not condemned to live or die as hungry ghosts. We can cultivate freedom through awareness, ethical living, and compassion, both for ourselves and for others. So the next time we hear a ghost story or feel a chill of fear, maybe we can pause and reflect. Is this fear pointing me to something unresolved in myself? Am I clinging to something that no longer serves me? Can I offer compassion to the suffering, both seen and unseen? Perhaps ghosts are not just lost spirits out there, but reminders from the universe to live more fully, more freely, and more awake. 2. The Pitta who wandered hungry, a lesson from the Tirokkutta Sutta. In the rich tapestry of Buddhist scripture, few stories touch the heart quite like the one found in the Tirokkutta Sutta, a discourse that quietly yet powerfully reveals how the living and the dead remain connected through compassion and conscious action. In this sutta, the Buddha tells the story of departed beings, relatives who had passed away and were reborn as pittas, wandering hungry and unseeing just beyond the walls of the world of the living. These beings are not frightening ghosts of folklore. They are those we once loved, now suffering because of their past unwholesome actions. Greed, selfishness, anger, and ignorance have led them to a state of existence where they long desperately for nourishment, both physical and spiritual, but are unable to receive it. The monks in the story, upon hearing of their suffering, are moved with compassion. They perform acts of merit, offering food to the Sangha, chanting sutras, practicing generosity, and dedicate the merits to their departed loved ones. What happens next is deeply symbolic. The hungry ghosts receive the merits and their suffering eases. They are nourished not by food itself, but by the intention behind the giving. It is love, extended beyond death, that brings peace. This story is not about superstition. It's about interconnectedness. It reflects a foundational Buddhist truth: our actions matter, and they ripple through dimensions far beyond what the eye can see. Rewriting our relationship with the past. Most of us carry within us some form of grief, whether it's the loss of a parent, a friend, or even someone we didn't part with on the best of terms. Sometimes we wonder, are they okay? Did they know I loved them? Could I have done more? Buddhism doesn't offer hollow reassurances. What it offers instead is agency. It tells us, yes, you can still help. Yes, you can still connect. Yes, your actions now can ease their journey. In this sense, performing acts of merit becomes a sacred dialogue across time and space. You are saying, I remember you. I honor you. May the goodness I cultivate bring you peace. It's a profound act of emotional and spiritual healing, not just for them, but for ourselves. A modern echo of an ancient truth. Years ago, I met a woman who lost her son in a tragic accident. In her grief, she felt helpless, unable to move on. A monk gently suggested that she could dedicate daily prayers and small acts of kindness in his name. She began volunteering at a local hospice, helping strangers in their final days. Each time she offered comfort to a dying person, she silently said, "For you, my son." She told me later that something changed, not in the world outside, but inside her heart. The heavy ache didn't vanish, but it softened. She no longer felt that her love was trapped in time. She had turned it into a bridge, a living thread of compassion between two worlds. Beyond the veil, there is responsibility. The Tirokkutta Sutta reminds us that what lies beyond death is not out of reach. It also warns us, our actions follow us. If we live selfishly, we might one day find ourselves yearning for something we can no longer attain. But it also gives us hope. Others can help us, and we can help others. The hungry ghosts in the sutta were not helped by rituals, exorcisms, or fear. They were helped by pure intentions. By generosity. By merit. This is the kind of spiritual technology Buddhism teaches, not one based on superstition, but on cause and effect, empathy, and ethical responsibility. So ask yourself, What can I offer to those who came before me? What unspoken words still echo in the silence? Can I turn grief into giving and sorrow into seeds of compassion? Because in Buddhism, the dead are not gone. They are waiting for our love to set them free. 3. A modern reflection, my grandmother's dream. Not all ghost stories are terrifying. Some are quiet, tender, and profoundly human. Sometimes, they don't even feel like ghost stories at all, more like echoes of love, memory, and unfinished connection. A few years ago, after my grandmother passed away, something strange and beautiful began to unfold. My mother, her daughter, started having the same dream over and over again. In the dream, she would see my grandmother sitting alone by a dry riverbank. She wasn't angry. She wasn't speaking. But there was something in her eyes, a mixture of sadness, confusion, and longing. She looked stuck. Each time my mother woke up, she felt a strange heaviness in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was grief that hadn't found a home. We had done all the conventional things, held the funeral, made offerings, said our goodbyes. But this dream wouldn't go away. Night after night, it returned, like a message trying to be heard. Eventually, my mother confided in a local monk. He listened patiently, and then gently said something that changed everything. Perhaps your mother is still in need of your compassion. Not your sadness, but your merit. He explained the Buddhist practice of dedicating merit, a way to consciously transfer the spiritual energy of our good actions to others, including those who have passed away. He suggested that we offer food to monks, practice generosity, and dedicate the merit to my grandmother, sincerely wishing her peace and freedom from suffering. So we did. We prepared a meal, offered it to the Sangha at the local temple, and during the dedication chant, we held her image in our minds. We didn't ask for signs. We didn't expect miracles. We simply gave from the heart, trusting that compassion travels further than we can see. That night, for the first time in weeks, my mother slept peacefully. The dream didn't return. Between memory and merit, what really happened? Now, some might say this was just a psychological resolution. That by taking spiritual action, my mother found closure. Maybe that's true. Or maybe, just maybe, something more subtle happened, something the intellect cannot measure, but the heart recognizes. In Buddhist philosophy, consciousness is not bound by time and space the way we think. Death doesn't sever the threads of relationship, it only shifts them to a different level. So when we act with mindful intention, that energy, whether we call it merit or love, can reach those in unseen realms. But even if we look at this through the lens of modern psychology, it's still powerful. We often carry unresolved emotions after a loved one's death, guilt, regret, sorrow. These emotions can manifest in dreams, in recurring thoughts, or in a lingering sense that something isn't finished. When we take conscious steps, through ritual, prayer, or acts of kindness, we are not just honoring the dead. We are healing the living, making peace across worlds. This experience with my grandmother taught me something that no book or sutra could have expressed so clearly: compassion doesn't expire. It doesn't stop when the heart stops beating. It keeps moving, keeps working, keeps liberating when we choose to let it flow. We don't need elaborate ceremonies. A simple act of kindness, done in someone's name. A prayer whispered under our breath. A moment of stillness where we say, "I remember you. May you be free." That's all it takes to turn memory into merit. And in doing so, we transform ourselves too. We become less haunted by loss and more grounded in love. Less attached to form and more connected to essence. Less afraid of death and more alive in the present. Because sometimes, the ghost is not our grandmother or our past, it's the part of us that hasn't learned to let go. And when we offer compassion, not just to others, but to the spaces within us that are stuck, we don't just free the dead. We free ourselves. 4. Why we see ghosts, fear, guilt, and the mind. Most people associate ghost sightings with external phenomena, shadows that move, strange sounds at night, or sudden chills in an empty room. But Buddhism invites us to shift our focus inward. Instead of asking, "What is that out there?" it urges us to ask, "What is happening inside me right now?" The Buddha taught that mind precedes all things. That every experience, pleasant, painful, or puzzling, begins in the mind. So when we see ghosts or feel haunted by invisible forces, we must ask, are we seeing an external reality? Or a reflection of something unresolved within? The hauntings within. Think of it this way: guilt is a ghost. Regret is a ghost. Unprocessed grief is a ghost. These emotions don't drift through hallways, but they wander through our thoughts, keep us up at night, and leave cold spaces in our hearts. They show up in dreams, and random triggers, and memories that refuse to stay buried. Sometimes, what we perceive as a supernatural encounter is our subconscious trying to speak. A shadowy figure may actually be a forgotten wound. A chilling presence might be a part of ourselves we've disowned. From a Buddhist perspective, these aren't just emotions, they're energies. And when they're ignored, they don't vanish. They manifest, subtly, symbolically, sometimes even visually. Have you ever felt haunted by something you did years ago? A word you regret, a choice you can't undo? That haunting is not coming from outside, it's arising from the depths of your own consciousness. The mind is a projector. Buddhist psychology compares the mind to a projector. It takes the raw film of our experiences, our karma, perceptions, biases, and projects them onto the screen of reality. If our mind is clouded with fear, we interpret neutral events as threatening. If it's burdened by guilt, we attract images of punishment. If it's filled with compassion, even darkness becomes a space for healing. So, when someone claims to see a ghost, Buddhism does not immediately deny or confirm. Instead, it asks, what state of mind were you in? Were you afraid, grieving, angry, or spiritually open? The perception itself may be real, but what it means depends entirely on the inner landscape of the observer. In deep states of meditation, practitioners often report seeing vivid imagery, beings, visions, lights, even ghosts. But experienced teachers don't get attached to these visions. They understand these appearances are mental constructions, expressions of karma and emotion. The goal is not to chase them, but to understand them and ultimately to transcend them. Fear is the real ghost. Fear itself is perhaps the most powerful ghost we face. It distorts reality. It narrows our vision. It makes us believe we are small, powerless, and alone. But fear, too, is a fabrication of the mind, a survival mechanism gone wild. The Buddha saw this clearly. That's why he taught mindfulness, not just to reduce stress, but to see through illusion. When we practice mindfulness, we learn to sit with fear instead of running from it. We breathe into the space that trembles. We open the door to the ghost and realize it was never an enemy, only a messenger from within. What's it telling you? That you haven't forgiven yourself? That you're holding on to someone who's already gone? That you're afraid to face your own impermanence? Once you listen, the haunting ends. Returning to clarity. In the end, what we call ghosts may simply be our unexamined minds reaching out for healing. Buddhism doesn't deny strange experiences, it reframes them. It says, if something appears to you, look not at the shadow, but at the light behind it. Look at the thoughts, emotions, and energies within you that created the condition for it to arise. Because the most terrifying ghost isn't the one in the corner of the room. It's the one we carry quietly in our chest, the ghost of avoidance. And the only exorcism we truly need is awareness. The neuroscience meets karma, what science is catching up to. For thousands of years, Buddhist monks have taught that the mind is not a passive observer of reality, but an active creator of it. What we think, feel, and focus on, these things shape the way we see the world, and ultimately, who we become. In the past, these ideas were often dismissed by the modern world as religious or mystical. But now, science is beginning to catch up. In recent decades, neuroscience has started uncovering truths that echo the Buddha's teachings, sometimes word for word. Concepts like neuroplasticity, the fear response in the brain, and the transformative power of mindfulness and meditation are now central topics in scientific journals, not just in monasteries. The science of fear and how we can change it. Let's begin with fear. Fear lives in the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure in the brain that scans for threats, real or imagined. When we hear a noise in the dark or recall a painful memory, it's the amygdala that fires up, putting us on edge. It's a useful part of our evolutionary design, meant to protect us. But in modern life, it often becomes overactive, responding to imagined threats as if they were real. That flicker of light? Ghost. That creak in the hallway? Spirit. That silence and grief? A haunting. But here's the powerful part: this reaction can be changed. Scientific studies now show that consistent meditation practice reduces amygdala activity. In other words, when we meditate regularly, our brain physically rewires itself to react less with fear and more with awareness and calm. Long before brain scans existed, the Buddha taught that mindfulness is the path to the deathless. Neuroscience now shows how that path reshapes the very structure of the mind. Karma and conditioning: what you practice, you become. In Buddhism, karma isn't some cosmic system of rewards and punishments. It's simply the law of cause and effect. Actions have consequences. Every thought, word, and deed plants a seed. Some grow into joy, others into suffering. Neuroscience offers a striking parallel. What we repeatedly think and feel creates neural pathways. When we focus on anger, those pathways strengthen. When we practice kindness, those circuits become dominant. The brain becomes a reflection of our inner habits, what Buddhists have always called mental formations or sankharas. So when the Buddha says, "We are what we think," with our thoughts, we make the world, he's not speaking metaphorically. He's stating a biological truth now visible on functional MRI machines. Meditation isn't just spiritual. It's neurological transformation. Ghosts, grief, and the brain stories. Science has also shown how unresolved trauma or grief can create vivid experiences, what some might interpret as ghost encounters. The brain, in moments of stress or loss, can blur the line between memory and reality. People report hearing the voices of the deceased, seeing visions, or feeling presences. From a neuroscientific perspective, these are understandable responses to emotional overload. From a Buddhist perspective, they are manifestations of karmic and mental energy, real in their own dimension, worthy of compassion and understanding, not fear or dismissal. The two perspectives don't cancel each other out. In fact, they complement one another beautifully. Where science explains the mechanism, Buddhism explains the meaning. A meeting point of wisdoms. This convergence between neuroscience and Buddhism is more than coincidence. It signals a shift in how we understand ourselves, not just as physical beings, but as conscious, changeable, interconnected systems of mind and intention. The Buddha never needed a lab to understand this. Through silent observation of his own mind, he discovered truths that today's scientists are just beginning to map. His teachings are not outdated religious philosophy, they're a manual for mental and emotional mastery. So whether you're a monk in the forest or a researcher in a lab, the message is the same. What you dwell upon, you become. Train your mind well, and it becomes your ally. Leave it untrained, and it becomes your ghost. 6. Why do ghosts exist in Buddhism, but not the way you think? In horror films and ghost stories, spirits are often portrayed as malevolent forces, creatures of vengeance, terror, or unfinished business. They haunt old houses, appear in mirrors, and frighten those who dare to disturb them. Pop culture thrives on this fear, turning ghosts into spectacles of darkness. But Buddhism offers a radically different view. It doesn't treat ghosts as monsters to be feared, but as beings to be understood, and, more importantly, as mirrors for our own lives. Pitas are not evil, they are suffering. In Buddhist cosmology, the beings most commonly associated with ghosts are called pitas, or hungry ghosts. But unlike in Hollywood, pitas are not spirits out to harm the living. They are beings caught in deep suffering, unable to satisfy their cravings, wandering through realms of deprivation, confusion, and isolation. These conditions are not imposed as punishment by some divine force. Rather, they are the natural result of past actions, karma unfolding. Pitas are born into their realm not because they were condemned, but because their mental states at the time of death and the accumulated energy of their actions shaped their rebirth. For instance, someone who lived with extreme greed, jealousy, or miserliness may find themselves in a state of constant hunger after death, not necessarily for food, but for satisfaction, attention, validation, or peace. The suffering of Pitas is a consequence, not a curse. This is an important distinction. Buddhism does not see the universe as governed by moral judgment, but by natural law. Just as a seed grows into a tree based on its nature and the environment, our actions bloom into our experiences, whether in this life or the next. The problem with popular ghost narratives. Popular culture tends to dramatize ghosts as disruptors of peace, entities that break the boundary between the living and the dead. They're feared, avoided, or fought against. This imagery feeds fear, but it also distorts our understanding. From a Buddhist standpoint, these portrayals are not just inaccurate, they're unhelpful. They keep us stuck in fear-based thinking and distract us from what really matters, our own actions, thoughts, and emotional states. Buddhism teaches us that we create ghosts in our own minds every day, when we hold onto grudges, cling to possessions, or act with unkindness. We don't have to die to become a hungry ghost. We become ghost-like when we live with insatiable desire, emptiness, and emotional isolation. Seeing Pitas as a call to transformation. Instead of being afraid of ghosts, Buddhism invites us to develop empathy. When we hear stories of Pitas, beings who suffer from unfulfilled longings, it should not trigger fear but reflection. Where in my own life am I acting like a hungry ghost? What am I clinging to that causes suffering? Can I transform my craving into contentment? My fear into understanding? When we contemplate Pitas through this lens, we begin to see that their stories are not about others, they're about all of us. Each of us has the potential to rise toward higher states of consciousness or fall into lower ones, depending on how we live. And here's the most empowering part, we can choose. Through generosity, mindfulness, and ethical living, we move away from the ghost realms, not just metaphysically, but psychologically and spiritually. We cultivate a mind that doesn't haunt or get haunted, but that radiates clarity, compassion, and peace. So yes, ghosts exist in Buddhism, but not as horrors hiding under the bed. They exist as expressions of karmic consequence, reminders of how suffering unfolds, and opportunities to reflect deeply on the nature of desire and liberation. Because ultimately, the ghost is not what you see in the dark. It's what you refuse to see in yourself. 7. A monastic encounter, when ghosts visit the mind, not the room. There's a quiet power in the way seasoned Buddhist monks speak about ghosts. They don't laugh them off, nor do they sensationalize the stories. They listen deeply, reflect slowly, and respond from a place of deep understanding. One such story came from a revered forest monk in Thailand, whose tale stayed with me, not because it was frightening, but because it was profoundly human. During a long silent retreat in a remote forest monastery, the monk spent months in solitude, meditating under trees, surrounded only by nature and silence. He told his students that during one particular night, while in deep meditation, he sensed something unusual, a presence. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream or knock things over. It simply was. He described it as a kind of sadness that filled the air, a weight that gently wrapped around him. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't react. He simply stayed present with it. And then, from the stillness of his own heart, he offered a few words, not spoken aloud, but silently, inwardly. If you are suffering, may you be free. If you are hungry, I offer you the merit of my practice. If you are lost, I wish you peace. Almost immediately, he said, the weight lifted. Not with a dramatic flourish, but like a soft wind passing through the trees. The presence was gone. Not banished, not destroyed, released. Not superstition, but compassion. The most remarkable thing about this story isn't that a monk sensed a ghostly being. It's that he met it not with fear, but with loving kindness. He didn't try to prove whether the being was real or imaginary. He didn't chant to protect himself or run for help. He did something far more radical. He responded with compassion. This is the heart of Buddhist practice. Whether the ghost was a wandering Pita, a memory from past karma, or simply a projection of the subconscious doesn't really matter. In that moment, the monk chose to see not a threat, but a being in pain. And through his kindness, transformation happened, not just for the being, but within himself. What we fear may need our love. So often, when we feel haunted by thoughts, regrets, or unknown fears, we assume we need to push them away. We try to exorcise the discomfort. But Buddhism invites us to do the opposite, to welcome it, to sit with it, to speak to it with understanding. What if the ghosts we encounter in our lives, literal or metaphorical, are not trying to harm us, but to be heard? That shadow at the edge of your awareness, could it be a part of you that's still hurting? That recurring dream, could it be a soul-seeking closure or an emotion-seeking release? That anxiety in your chest, could it be an invitation to meet yourself more fully? The monk's story shows us that we don't need to understand everything in order to respond wisely. We just need to be present and to choose compassion over fear, turning encounters into opportunities. In the modern world, we are taught to run from discomfort. But spiritual practice asks us to turn toward it. To see every experience, pleasant or strange, joyful or sorrowful, as a chance to grow in awareness and empathy. The monk did not defeat the ghost. He did not solve a mystery. What he did was far more powerful. He transformed a moment of unease into a moment of liberation. And perhaps, that's all we're ever being asked to do. 8. The real ghosts we carry: regret, clinging, and fear. Not all ghosts dwell in graveyards. Some live in our minds. Some sleep inside our memories. Some whisper inside our hearts when the world gets quiet. When we think of ghosts, we often imagine external beings, lost souls wandering through the night, tied to a place, a memory, or an unfinished story. But in Buddhist thought, the most persistent and haunting ghosts are not outside of us. They are within. These are the ghosts of regret, of clinging, of fear, invisible yet heavy, unspoken yet loud. Regret, the ghost of what wasn't. Regret is a haunting. It is the pain of what we didn't say, the love we didn't express, the chances we didn't take. Regret lingers like a cold presence, appearing at night, in quiet moments, or during loss. And like a ghost, it can't be touched or reasoned with. It simply is, until we choose to face it. Buddhism teaches us not to suppress regret, but to transform it. We look at it directly, not with judgment, but with awareness. We ask, what have I learned? Can I offer forgiveness? Can I act differently now? The ghost of regret doesn't want revenge. It wants reconciliation. Clinging, the ghost that never leaves. Clinging is another ghost, subtle, seductive, relentless. We cling to relationships, identities, possessions, beliefs, memories. We hold on, afraid that letting go means losing who we are. But Buddhism reminds us, everything is impermanent. And clinging to the impermanent is the very root of suffering. A wise teacher once said, "The tighter you hold the water in your hand, the faster it slips through your fingers." When we cling, we do not preserve, we strangle. We turn life into a prison of expectations and fears. But when we loosen our grip, when we let go, we allow life to move, breathe, and evolve. Letting go is not giving up. It is giving freedom to others and to ourselves. Fear, the ghost of the unknown. Perhaps the most powerful ghost we carry is fear, especially the fear of the unknown. The fear of death, of being forgotten, of losing control, of disappearing. Fear paralyzes. It makes us small. It whispers lies like, "You are not safe. You are not enough. You must cling tighter." But Buddhism teaches that fear is not to be feared. It is to be seen clearly, with mindfulness. When we bring gentle attention to fear, we begin to realize something profound. Fear is a habit of mind, not a truth of reality. Through practices like meditation, loving kindness, metta, and contemplation of impermanence, we learn to befriend fear. We learn to sit with it, breathe with it, smile at it. And slowly, its grip weakens. As Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote, "Smile to your fear. It is just a small child who wants your attention." setting ourselves free. The ghosts we carry don't need to be exorcised. They need to be understood. They need to be listened to. They need to be loved. In Buddhism, liberation doesn't come from defeating external enemies. It comes from freeing ourselves from internal bondage, from the loops of craving, aversion, and delusion that haunt us day after day. So ask yourself, what regrets still weigh down your heart? What are you clinging to that is already fading? What fears keep you from living fully? Then breathe. Acknowledge them. Hold them gently. And slowly, one by one, begin to let them go. Because you are not a haunted house. You are a sacred temple. And you deserve to live unburdened, awake, and free. 9. Rebirth and consciousness. Life after death is not the end. Death is often seen as the final curtain, the point of no return. In many cultures, it's feared, avoided in conversation, and wrapped in layers of mystery and superstition. But in Buddhism, death is neither the end nor the ultimate tragedy. It is simply a transition, a passing from one state of being to another. And the most important question is not what happens when we die. It is, what is the state of our mind in the moment we die? The stream of consciousness, not a soul, but a flow. Unlike many religions, Buddhism does not teach that we have an eternal soul, Atman, that travels from life to life. Instead, it speaks of a continuous stream of consciousness, ever-changing, always flowing, like a river that never carries the same water twice. What moves from one life to the next is not a fixed self, but a karmic momentum, a flow of mental, emotional, and ethical energy shaped by our actions, intentions, and mental habits. Just as a flame lights the next candle without itself moving, our consciousness conditions the next moment of existence, even after physical death. This is why the Buddha placed such great emphasis on mindfulness, not just in life, but especially at the moment of death. Because the mind's final state doesn't just reflect how we've lived, it shapes where we go next. The death moment, a seed for rebirth. According to the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist analytical psychology, the final thought moment at the time of death is incredibly powerful. It acts like a seed, determining the next birth. If that moment is filled with fear, anger, or craving, the rebirth may be in a lower realm, such as the realm of Pitas, hungry ghosts, animals, or even hell beings. These are not places of eternal damnation, but realms of intensified suffering, rooted in the very emotions we could not release in life. But if we pass away with peace, love, forgiveness, or clarity, then that gentle energy carries us toward more favorable rebirths, perhaps in the human realm again, or in the heavenly realms of joy and insight. This is not about superstition. It is about responsibility and empowerment. Buddhism tells us, you are shaping your next life right now, through how you speak, act, and think. A call to live with presence now. Understanding rebirth doesn't mean we wait for death to become wise. Quite the opposite, it wakes us up to the urgency of living with awareness now. Each moment we live in hatred adds weight to our consciousness. Each act of compassion lightens it. Each thought of jealousy poisons the stream. Each moment of generosity purifies it. So if death is simply the continuation of a mental and moral momentum, then life is the training ground. And that means every single moment is sacred. Not because it leads to heaven or hell, but because it shapes what we become next. Letting go of the fear of death. Perhaps the most liberating truth in Buddhism is that we don't need to fear death, we need to understand it. When we realize that death is just a doorway, and that we hold the key to what lies beyond, fear naturally begins to dissolve. Instead of clinging to life with panic, we begin to live it with gratitude. Instead of hiding from impermanence, we bow to it. Instead of running from the unknown, we prepare for it, with each breath, each thought, each choice. In the end, the question is not, what will happen to me when I die? But rather, who am I becoming right now, moment by moment? Science, spirituality, and the space between. For centuries, science and spirituality seemed to walk in opposite directions. One relied on data, logic, and physical evidence. The other trusted direct experience, introspection, and the unseen. But as both fields mature, something surprising is happening. They're beginning to meet in the middle. Nowhere is this more evident than in the study of consciousness, the very thing that thinks, feels, dreams, remembers, and perhaps encounters ghosts. The limits of the scientific lens. Let's begin with humility. Science is a powerful tool. It has helped us explore galaxies, understand DNA, and map the neural pathways of the brain. But when it comes to the subjective nature of experience, why we dream, why we grieve, why some people see apparitions or feel a spiritual presence, science begins to struggle. You can scan a brain during meditation. You can measure brain waves during sleep. But you can't locate love, longing, or liberation in a microscope. These things are real, but not always measurable. This is where Buddhism has always offered something invaluable, an inner science of the mind. Buddhism is inner science. Long before psychology and neuroscience existed, Buddhist monks were training in precise observation of consciousness, not through lab experiments, but through meditation, introspection, and ethical living. They mapped states of mind, recognized patterns of suffering, and learned how intention shaped perception. And now, as modern scientists study meditation and altered states, they're beginning to confirm what ancient sages have long known. Meditation changes the brain. It strengthens the prefrontal cortex, calms the amygdala, and rewires how we respond to stress and fear. Compassion isn't just a feeling, it's a trainable state. Brain imaging shows that loving-kindness practices, like metta, activate areas related to empathy and connection. Near-death experiences, mystical visions, and even so-called ghost encounters often correlate with unique neurological activity, emotional intensity, and altered states of consciousness. But here's what's important: Buddhism doesn't claim these experiences prove the supernatural. Instead, it gently suggests, what you perceive reflects your mind's condition. Your internal world colors your external experience. Whether what you saw was real is secondary to what it reveals about you. Mind is the bridge between worlds. In Buddhist philosophy, the mind isn't just a brain function, it's the primary lens through which all reality is filtered. The Buddha said, "With our thoughts, we make the world." That doesn't mean the world is imaginary. It means our relationship to it is shaped by our beliefs, emotions, and perceptions. Ghosts, spirits, visions, these may arise not from outside us, but from deep within, as symbolic expressions of karma, longing, or unresolved energy. From this perspective, science and Buddhism don't conflict, they complement each other. Science asks, what happens in the brain when we meditate? Buddhism asks, what happens in the heart when we let go? The space between. So where do science and spirituality meet? In the space between certainty and mystery. In the moment when we don't rush to explain, but simply sit and witness. In the quiet realization that not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything we experience needs to be proven to be meaningful. That space, the one between logic and intuition, thought and silence, is where transformation happens. It's where the monk meets the ghost and offers merit. It's where the grieving daughter dreams of her mother. It's where neuroscience confirms what compassion has always taught. It's the space where truth isn't just something you know, it's something you become. 11. Freeing ourselves from the ghosts within. So, after all this reflection, let's return to the question we began with. Are ghosts real? From a Buddhist perspective, it's not the most important question. The better question might be, what haunts you, and how can you be free? Because while some ghosts may indeed be lost spirits, what truly lingers in most of our lives are the inner phantoms. Regrets we haven't forgiven. Attachments we refuse to release. Fears we carry silently. Stories we keep reliving. These are the ghosts that shape our reality far more than anything supernatural ever could. Liberation is an inside job. The Buddha didn't teach ghost hunting. He taught liberation. He didn't ask us to conquer outer demons. He asked us to understand the inner ones. His path wasn't about proving life after death. It was about living fully before death. And so, the teachings about Pitas, the hungry ghosts, aren't warnings about haunted houses. They're reminders about haunted hearts. They urge us to look at our lives honestly. Are we living with integrity, kindness, and awareness? Or are we chasing satisfaction like a ghost with a needle-sized mouth and an endless hunger? If we live in craving, we suffer. If we live in generosity, we heal. This is not punishment or reward, it's law, like gravity. It's karma. Turning toward, not away. So what do we do with all this? We stop running. We stop distracting ourselves from what's uncomfortable. We stop fearing what we don't understand. Instead, we turn toward the ghosts, whether they're from the past, the subconscious, or the spirit realm, with mindfulness, compassion, and courage. We sit with them. We speak to them. We learn from them. Because more often than not, ghosts don't want to harm us. They want to be seen. They want to be understood. And they want to be released. A path forward. Buddhism offers us the tools to do this. Through meditation, we begin to observe the mind instead of being overwhelmed by it. Through ethical living, we create fewer regrets that might return as shadows. Through generosity and merit, we help those who suffer, whether alive or beyond this life. Through loving kindness, we soften our hearts so they become shelters, not prisons. This is how we break the cycle. This is how we end the haunting. Not by chanting louder, but by listening deeper. Final reflections. In the end, the most powerful transformation doesn't happen through dramatic visions or supernatural proofs. It happens in the quietest of places, when a mind lets go, when a heart forgives, when a soul finally breathes again. Whether ghosts exist or not, one thing is certain. We don't have to live like ghosts, half alive, haunted, hungry. We can choose presence over panic, compassion over control, freedom over fear. Because the way out of the haunted house is not through the door. It's through the heart. May we all walk this path gently, with courage and clarity. May we free not only the ghosts of others, but the ones we've hidden inside ourselves. May our lives become places where even wandering spirits find peace.